The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the fiscal year 2025 Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund grant program. This presentation will provide a program overview and discuss the application process for all eligible entities that may be interested in applying for physical preservation projects. This includes state, tribal, and territorial governments, local governments including certified local governments, as well as nonprofits. For state and tribal historic preservation offices, a separate presentation is available on our YouTube channel for those that may be interested in applying for both or either funding opportunities available under this program. Before I jump into the background information regarding the new disaster recovery funding, I did want to provide some basic background information regarding the Historic Preservation Fund itself. So the Historic Preservation Fund is the funding source for this program. It is also the funding source for many of our preservation assistance grants that we provide, including the annual grants that we provide to the state and tribal historic preservation offices. The source for the funding actually comes from outer continental shelf oil and gas lease revenue, not tax dollars. The idea being that the revenue from the use of one non-renewable resource is still being invested into another resource. Regarding this disaster funding, it works a little bit differently than a lot of our other annual or competitive programs. So from time to time, Congress may decide to appropriate supplemental funds from the Historic Preservation Fund for disaster recovery, more specifically to provide relief to owners of historic properties and to support preservation and recovery in communities that have received presidentially declared disasters. So we have had a few of these supplemental appropriations in the recent past. We had a previous program for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we had a program for Hurricane Sandy, and then we have our two ongoing programs for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, as well as Hurricanes Florence and Michael and Typhoon U2 out in the Pacific. They have all typically been appropriated by Congress at approximately $50 million. And as you can see, historically, they have typically been focused on hurricane recovery. But I will add that this new funding for fiscal year 2025, the appropriations language is actually a little bit different. So it's not for a specific named storm like the programs above. It has a bit of a broader reach geographically and in terms of the types of natural disasters that are eligible under this new funding. So the new fiscal year 2025 funding was most recently appropriated under the continuing resolution that was passed this past December in 2024. And it calls for an additional amount from the Historic Preservation Fund for necessary expenses related to the consequences of natural disasters. Given the very broad language of the appropriation and the volume of disasters that are eligible under this new funding, we are running the program a bit differently than we have in previous years for the programs that I discussed on the previous slide. So $48 million will be awarded competitively, but under two notices of funding opportunity or NOFOs. Previously, under the earlier programs, we awarded the funds under one notice of funding opportunity to eligible state and tribal historic preservation offices only. Under this program, we will have one notice of funding opportunity for capacity and survey grants that will just be open to the state and tribal historic preservation offices. And we have the second notice of funding opportunity that is being discussed here for physical preservation work. But it is open not only to SHPOs and TIPOs, it is also open to other state, tribal, and territorial government agencies, local governments, including certified local governments, as well as nonprofits. Also different from our previous program, we are not doing subgrants, so all projects should be planned to be managed either in-house or as contract projects, and no match is required for the program as well. In terms of determining eligibility, the program is eligible to impacted resources in areas that have received a major disaster declaration pursuant to the Stafford Act and with an incident period beginning in calendar years 2023 and or 2024. So the historic or cultural resource that you are intending to work on needs to be located within the area that has received the major disaster declaration. It should have documented damage that it was impacted by that disaster, and the incident period for the disaster must begin in either 2023 or 2024. As far as determining eligibility, if you need to look up a specific incident period date or a disaster declaration number, I would recommend using FEMA's disaster declaration search page, which is listed here, and I'll also include it in the description for this video. But we have also created a web map tool using FEMA's data to help you search the location of specific resources layered with eligible areas. So this next slide kind of walks you through how to use the tool. You'll see over on the left-hand side, once you open the web page, that it'll show you some quick instructions over on the left-hand side. You can filter by the year, so you can filter by either disasters in 2023 and or 2024. You can also filter by the declaration number if you happen to know the number, and once you select it, it'll pan over to that disaster area. You can also filter by named disaster. Not every disaster that is eligible under this program has a specific name, but if it is, say, a major hurricane like Hurricane Helene, you'll be able to select those by name and filter and pan over to those locations. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see the little caret, and that'll drop down a menu where you can, one, search for specific locations. You can use your current location if you want to look at resources that are directly around you. There's also a shortcut for that current location over on the bottom right-hand side. But you can search for a town or a city or a specific resource. So if we wanted to search, say, Asheville, North Carolina, it'll pan over and show you Asheville and the disaster declaration highlighted for that area. You can also search for a specific resource, say something like the Biltmore Estate located in Asheville, and it'll pan over to that specific resource. That'll pop out the legend, and then you can also turn on and off additional layers. So there's an additional layer for certified local governments. So if you wanted to see how your CLG overlays with some of the disaster declared counties, you could turn that layer on. We also have a layer for tribal lands. Additionally, those areas that are darker in color typically indicate that there is more than one disaster declaration in those counties. So if you are trying to see multiple of those disaster declarations, you can click on that area, and then on the right bottom hand side, you'll see sort of a little list icon. When you click that, it'll give you the list of all of the disaster declarations in that area. And then you can also use the carets down at the bottom on the left-hand side of that window to scroll through those different disaster declarations. As far as tribal lands, there are some tribes that may have their own specific disaster declarations, but if that is not the case, you can also check to see where your tribal lands overlay with areas that have received their own specific disaster declarations by county. So in this case, you can see here the Miccosukee Reservation. They do have their own disaster declaration for their tribal lands, but you can also see how it's overlaid with other areas that have also received disaster declarations. So you, as a tribal nation, you do not necessarily have to have your own disaster declaration, but if your tribal lands overlap with one of those areas, those projects would also be eligible. Certainly, if you have any questions about eligibility or using any of these tools, or if it seems like some information may be missing, feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and we're happy to look into any of those issues. So jumping over to the Notice of Funding Opportunity itself, I'll kind of walk through an overview of the program here. We'll talk through the application process and some of the requirements, and then we'll kind of talk through a few frequently asked questions to wrap things up. So The Notice of Funding Opportunity you'll see listed in grants.gov under the last 3 digits 489. Also, please double check when you are applying that you are selecting the correct funding opportunity title. So it should be listed as the Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund - Preservation. You'll see the other NOFO listed in there for capacity grants. So please make sure to select the correct funding opportunity. As I mentioned before, in terms of eligible entities, it is open more broadly than our previous programs. So it is open, of course, to state and tribal historic preservation offices, but other state and territorial government agencies are also eligible to apply. It is open to federally recognized Indian tribes, Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian organizations, and that includes those that don't necessarily have a tribal historic preservation office as well. Local governments, including certified local governments, are also eligible to apply, as well as nonprofit organizations and educational institutions. The grants can range from $75,000 to $15 million, and matching funds are not required. This range is very, very large, but that is intentional. You can come in for a smaller project, or you can apply to work on multiple sites under one application. We encourage you to ask for what you need. Keep in mind that the pot of money is $48 million for almost 200 or so different disaster declarations across 2023 and 2024, but we do encourage you to ask for what you need and don't feel like it is all or nothing. You could still potentially have a partial award, even if we're not able to award for all of the sites that you are interested in repairing. One tip that we would offer is to include in the narrative of your application a priority list of what resources may be in the most need or that you would most like to focus on, so that we can have that as part of consideration in terms of what might be of highest urgency. So in summary, the funding for the Preservation Notice of Funding Opportunity is for states, tribes, local governments, and nonprofits for defined repair and recovery projects. It can include reconstruction for resources with documented damage from a major disaster declaration occurring in calendar years 2023 and or 2024. And the deadline for this application is July 15th. And a reminder that you must apply for the program in grants.gov. In terms of eligible activities, the focus for the program is on physical preservation, but administration, National Register, planning, survey and inventory, and review and compliance activities to support that recovery work are also eligible and allowable activities. Pre-preservation projects are eligible under this program, so that might include developing plans and specs, or maybe doing historic structure reports for a group of buildings across a downtown. The one thing I will note is that archaeological and architectural surveys that seek to only identify sites are not eligible under this Notice of Funding Opportunity. Projects that involve just pre-preservation activities should also not exceed 20% of the estimated construction cost, so we are looking for you to make a logical case for the cost that you're presenting. As far as preservation projects, these would be physical preservation and repairs to historic districts, buildings, sites, structures, and objects. And a reminder that this work must comply with Section 106, Section 110 for National Historic Landmarks, and the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as you will need to execute a preservation agreement for the resources that you work on. Pre-preservation costs, again, should also not exceed 20% of the total preservation project cost for each site. So let's say you're a nonprofit that comes in to repair 4 buildings across a downtown and they all still need plans and specs. The cost of those plans and specs should not exceed 20% of the project cost for each building. So the 20% does not apply to your project budget as a whole with your application. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. Reconstruction of properties is also potentially eligible under this program, which is a bit different from most of the other programs under the Historic Preservation Fund. Reconstruction is eligible if it's determined that another of the Secretary of the Interior's treatment standards are not appropriate. The project must also meet the Secretary of the Interior standard to reconstruction, and you must have documentation that the damage is attributable to an eligible declared disaster. But if you are considering reconstruction, we do highly encourage you to reach out with any questions or to talk through any project ideas, since it is a bit different than some of our previous programs. Projects must also substantially mitigate the threat and include steps to mitigate future risk. One last point I'll kind of touch on here as well is also think about any staffing needs that you might have in order to support this work. So you can apply for the capacity you might need to manage these projects. So if you need to hire staff to manage them, we encourage you to include that in your application under personnel or contracts or something like that. What is not funded? So I won't walk through everything that is on this list, but I did want to highlight a few of the items here. So construction of new buildings that are not approved reconstruction projects are not allowable. Costs for work that's already been completed or funded through other federal programs, which includes costs that may be reimbursed by FEMA, are not allowable. Costs reimbursed by insurance are also not allowable. However, that doesn't mean that you can have multiple pots of funding. So let's say you have a building where FEMA is paying for the roof, we could still potentially pay for the repairs to the windows and doors or something like that. Our one suggestion is just to make sure that it is clear that they are separate scopes of work and that the funding lines are kept separated. Administrative costs to manage the grant may also not exceed 25% of the total budget by statute, and that is inclusive of any indirect costs. I will also highlight that contingencies are not an allowable cost. I mention this because I know that contractors often like to include that in their budget estimates, but when you are filling out the budget justification worksheet, any of the costs that you are listing should be tied to specific work items. And then work performed prior to award announcement. So pre-award costs are typically not allowable. The one exception to this for the disaster program is that pre-award costs may be eligible for reimbursement if it was damage that occurred within the FEMA declared disaster period. So if it took place during the response and recovery phase, it may still potentially be eligible. But if you're unsure or you have any questions about that, please reach out to us with any specific questions. So just to kind of get you thinking through some ideas and brainstorming, some examples of projects that you might think about include, say, rehabilitation or reconstruction of several buildings across a historic downtown, or maybe several buildings across the state. I will add that there doesn't need to be a thematic link between the projects if you're planning to work on multiple different properties. The main requirement is that each of those resources should be eligible based on a disaster declaration. You could also do some more pre-preservation work, like hiring a consultant or architectural and engineering services to complete historic structure reports or plans and specs for a group of buildings. You could also focus on one building. Maybe there's one major elevation project for a historic property that's had repeated flood events that you want to focus solely on that. So a lot of different options. If you're not sure where to start or need some ideas, again, feel free to reach out and we're happy to chat through what you might need. Okay, so a quick note on National Register requirements for this program. So resources must be listed in or determined eligible by the applicable state or tribal historic preservation office for listing in the National Register, an equivalent tribal register, or designated a National Historic Landmark in order to be eligible. And it can be listed either individually or as contributing to a historic district. If the project is not yet listed, you must prepare a nomination as part of the grant project. But please keep in mind that those activities for preparing the nomination or hiring a consultant to help draft and do the research for that nomination are all eligible costs to the grant. So you can include those in your budget and project narrative. I will note that an updated nomination may not be required for listed resources that are reconstructed under this program, but grantees should plan to still work closely with your MPS grant manager, as well as National Register and/or National Historic Landmark staff to document the changes that were part of this project. But if you're not sure about the listing for a resource you're thinking about, or you still need a determination of eligibility for your application, please contact your state or tribal historic preservation office. And if you're not sure who to contact or where to start, we're happy to help connect you all on that front as well. In terms of application materials, all of the required documents that should be uploaded with your application are listed in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and can be found in grants.gov. But just for general awareness, all of the documents that you see listed here on the left-hand side are all of the required financial documents, and most of the documents that you see listed on the right-hand side you will find under the Related Documents tab in grants.gov. Specifically, that's where you'll find the project description worksheet, the budget justification worksheet, the project images worksheet, as well as the National Register eligibility worksheet. As far as the letter of owner consent and letter of support, even though individual property owners are not eligible to apply on their own, you are welcome as an eligible entity to apply to do repairs on their behalf. If that is the case, you should be including the letter of owner consent for performing that work on their behalf. So as I mentioned earlier, you do need to submit documentation indicating that the damage to the resources are a result of an eligible disaster. So you should be including photos that document that damage. The photos should depict the condition of the resources before and after the disaster, and the before photos should be as recent as possible. You can submit historic photographs, but they should be submitted in addition to those before and after photographs. And we do encourage you to submit historic photographs, particularly if you're proposing reconstruction. Don't feel like the before photo in particular needs to be something that you took immediately before the disaster. We're open to alternative documentation and encourage creativity in finding a source for that photo. So it could be from a news article, maybe there's a photo of the building from a press release for a community event that you did, a few months before. It could be from a social media post, Google Earth images. We've used screenshots from TV news reports. So, think outside the box if you're having trouble, tracking down one of those before photos. The photos should also show the current conditions and damage and any immediate threats to the resource. So we want to have an understanding of what the status and condition of the building is at this point in time, as far as where the construction will be starting from. And please keep in mind, as you're preparing these application materials, that all applications must include all of the items that are listed in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Incomplete applications that are missing any of these materials will not be considered for funding. Evaluation criteria. So applications will be assessed based on 4 different criteria. The first is significance, so describing the resource or resources receiving assistance and their historic, cultural significance at the national, state, tribal, and/or local level. In terms of need, urgency, and threat, their proposed project should address issues that threaten the resource as a result of an eligible major disaster declaration and fulfill a clear financial need. Documentation of the damage should also be included in the application. This would also be a good section to talk a bit more about your priorities list. So if you're planning to work on multiple buildings, talking about which ones might have the highest need or urgency. In terms of feasibility, the proposed project should be achievable within 3 years, and this would be the space to talk about and list out each of the projects that you're intending to work on if there are multiple. In terms of sustainability, proposed projects should provide a community benefit, and that's open for you to broadly define. So it could be a community center that you're repairing that'll reopen. It could be the building could be home to a small business that'll reopen, on a historic downtown Main Street or something like that. So open to interpretation, but looking for some type of community benefit. The project should also develop sustainable long-term preservation of the resource, including mitigation and risk management for future damage and potential future disasters. In addition to the evaluation criteria, we may also use planning numbers derived from US Census and FEMA data to guide allocation of the funding across affected areas. Again, as we discussed before, applicants are encouraged to apply for the funding that they need, but should also take into account the amount of funding available for a large number of major disaster declarations eligible under this FY2025 appropriation. And again, applicants may still potentially receive partial awards even if the full amount requested cannot be accommodated. So it doesn't necessarily need to be all or nothing for your application. If you are selected for an award, I did want to highlight a few grant requirements that you should be keeping in mind. The first is compliance with 2 CFR 200. This includes competitive selection and NPS approval for consultants and contractors working on your project. States and tribes should plan to follow their internal procurement policies and procedures as applicable as well. Funding will be primarily provided on a reimbursement basis as well, and those funds are accessed through the U.S. Treasury's Automated Standard Application for Payment, or ASAP system. In most cases, a physical preservation project will require a project sign. All work should also meet the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservation, and it again will require compliance with Section 106 and the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as Section 110 for any National Historic Landmarks. I did mention easements and preservation agreements a little bit earlier, but do keep in mind that easements will be required for each site that you're working on. So one point I just want to emphasize is that the easement duration will be based on the project cost for each site. So similar to our discussion earlier of the pre-preservation costs, if your grant award as a whole, let's say, is $5 million, but the project or construction at one site costs $750,000, the easement for that property would be 20 years and match up with the $750,000 budget. Additionally, once the grants are awarded under this program, we will be utilizing the process that is outlined in the Nationwide Programmatic Agreement to meet our responsibilities under Section 106. This will not have a significant change on the compliance and technical review process for most of the projects under this program, unless you are a state or tribal historic preservation office. But I did want to highlight this agreement briefly, as it is a bit different from our previous disaster grant programs, where we had to kind of start the programmatic agreement process from scratch at the start of each program. So in this case, the nationwide programmatic agreement is already in place and will be ready for use as soon as the grants are awarded. With that said, the National Park Service will still be responsible for tribal consultation and consultation with Native Hawaiian organizations, and we will also continue to be responsible for NEPA review. Okay, next steps. So the deadline for the preservation grants is July 15th, so the application is open on grants.gov for 60 days. My first recommendation, if you're trying to figure out where to start with your application, is to make sure that your organization is registered in sam.gov and that you obtain your unique entity identifier number. This process can take some time, and you need that UEI number in order to submit your application in grants.gov. So if there is anything that you start today, that is what I would recommend. We anticipate award announcement for the preservation grants in early fall. That is always subject to change, but that is our goal, to get you all moving on disaster recovery and repairs as quickly as we can. Just to wrap up here, I wanted to go over a few frequently asked questions. I've touched on a lot of this information throughout the presentation already, so feel free to stop here, but I did want to touch on some of these points in a little bit more detail before we sign off. So, will this funding include subgrant programs? Again, no, but applicants are encouraged to apply for multiple projects under one application. However, the projects and the sites should be defined at the time of submission. Applicants should also plan to manage those projects either in-house or through contractors or consultants, but remember that you can include those personnel and staffing costs in the budget to support project management. So, please include any costs that you might need for capacity to run those projects. As far as private individuals, they are not eligible to apply directly, but again, eligible applicants can apply on behalf of those owners. If you do choose to do that, do remember that you do need to include a letter of owner consent, providing written permission from the owner for the applicant to, 1, complete the project, that they're agreeing to execute any applicable easements, and for any applicable National Register nominations that may be needed if the site is eligible but unlisted at this point. So, for example, a state historic preservation office or a nonprofit might apply on behalf of multiple property owners in a historic district and could procure one contractor to carry out the repairs for that group of buildings, but the application should include the owner consent for each of those property owners. Can an applicant receive a partial award? Again, applications are not all or nothing. We encourage you to apply for the funding that you genuinely need, but if the full amount requested can't be accommodated, you may still potentially receive a partial award. Again, as we discussed earlier, it can be helpful for you to explain your priority list in your application. So if there are resources that might have a higher need or urgency for stabilization, providing those details in your application so we can better understand what's needed and what those associated costs are if a partial award were to be considered for those resources. In terms of how much funding will be available for the preservation notice of funding of opportunity, again, ask for what you need, but take into account that the total pot of money is ultimately $48 million. The intention is that funds will be awarded to the state and tribal historic preservation offices first under the capacity notice of funding opportunity, and then the remaining funds will be awarded on a competitive basis to eligible entities under this preservation notice of funding opportunity. Can you do survey work under the preservation notice of funding opportunity? For preservation, survey is only eligible if it is required for pre-preservation work. So for example, archaeological investigations can sometimes be necessary prior to some physical preservation like reconstruction activities. However, archaeological and architectural surveys that seek to only identify sites are not eligible under the preservation notice of funding opportunity. And lastly, should you submit separate applications for separate projects? No, you can submit one application for all of the planned projects under one entity. However, each project should be defined in the application and described in detail in the project description worksheet. So, for example, if you're a nonprofit and you're planning to manage a contract for physical repairs across multiple buildings across the state or across a historic downtown, let's say, you would submit one application and then describe each of the intended project sites in that one application. And I will finish it up there. So I'm posting our contact information here. Again, if you have any questions or you want to run any project ideas by us or brainstorm a bit, please reach out to us. We're happy to chat in more detail regarding any specific questions or specific project ideas you might have. Thank you.